the important question, I think, is why should we consider Ali Shariati a post-colonial theorist? I mean, let me just say that I always wonder why Shariati has raised so many eyebrows. I mean, he has been called, and this is the worst, he has been called monster, anti-human right, warmonger, traitor, and many other things. I was reading an article the other day entitled "A Monster Called Shariati," where the author listed various allegations against him, starting from how Shariati used religion to incite people against the Shah, which, by the way, questioned his sincerity and belief, how he spread Sunni beliefs, how he was overwhelmed by the ideas of the past, and that also that he was not an academic in the true sense of the word, and was more of a sentimental person, like a poet or even a populist. That he reduced religion to ideology, that he had left no room for reformation when there were forces that wanted to, that sought to reform the country. That he would always call for a revolution no matter what. That, but above all, he has been accused of, sponsoring the Velayat Faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurists, for his emphasis on ideology, meant for many people that the society needs an ideologue. He has also been held accountable for whatever happened after his departure. I mean, in the midst of all these enmities, Shariati's position and ideas were not safeguarded and understood as well as they should have been. Well, there is no doubt that Shariati reignited the engine of the revolution, but it's so unfair to hold him, accountable for every unpleasant single thing that happened after his departure. And no one says Shariati was perfect or made no mistake, and we are not ignoring, the limitations that plagued his work. But what we must remember is that Shariati had created Islam, a religious movement, introduced Islam as a political idea, and educated the youth. This is the important one: educated the youth against colonialism, imperialism, and Zionism. But he addressed Eurocentric modernity's hegemony, the erasure and reconstruction of non-Eurocentric tradition, as well as exclusionary structure under the global modern world system. It's so unfortunate that his anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist stand is less known and less studied. But in many parts of the Muslim world, Dustin just said that in America, in many of the Department of Philosophy across American university, they don't know Shariati. I mean, in many parts of the Muslim world also, Shariati is considered only a controversial and non-conformist Islamic thinker. Much of his scholarship, regarding empire, Eurocentrism, modernity, and revolution seems to be missing. Much of his work dealing with social theory and contribution to the canons of social sciences also seem to be absent. So while we have been advised against labeling him as the outstanding intellectual of the contemporary Iran, or the phenomenon of the Islamic Revolution, or any other laudatory epithets, I labeled him as a spokesman of intellectual decolonization and one of the earlier post-colonial thinkers that have been concerned with investigating the various trajectory of modernity in Dustin Bird's and Jawad Miri's edited book on Shariati. Well, in the book, I argued that as opposed to the dichotomous forces of modernism and traditionalism, Shariati sought to develop a concurrent critique of modernity and traditional culture, and opted for a third way. This third way was an alternative ontological foundation to that of Enlightenment modernity for negotiating a discourse of agency and human emancipation in Iranian society. Well, he contributed significantly to the decades-long effort in the post-colonial context to negotiate a third way between Eurocentrism and nativism, between hegemonic universalism and essentialist particularism. The revisiting and restructuring of cultural identity in Muslim societies was his particular response to the colonial and new colonial condition of Western hegemony and cultural alienation. His works emphasize the condition of human emancipation and the challenges of a common humanity. For Shariati, therefore, negotiating an alternative to colonial modernity comprises of an attempt to emancipate the people of their societies from cultural, political, economic manifestation of European colonialism. Now, speaking of alternative, Shariati presented his civilizational discourse as an alternative to the prevailing discourse of modernization. In a lecture entitled Tamaddun wa Tajaddud, or Civilization and Modernization, he posited that the prerequisite to a genuine development is not the top-down imposition of Western modernity, but it is a radical bottom-up change on the basis of a sustained critical engagement with the cultural resources of each society. Shariati was right to take umbrage at the fact that some of the intellectuals back then could not recognize the difference or even the contradiction between modernity and civilization. What was imported into the country was not civilization, but modernity. As to Shariati, civilization refers to a capacity for intellectual and material production. Well, taking this consideration into actual definition into consideration, civilization suggests alert actions of self-generation, volition, and an innovative adoption which could neither be imitated nor imposed. But Shariati was of the idea that both culture of the tradition and modernity has caused the social decay and spiritual poverty. While criticizing the infatuated modernists and the retarded traditionalists, he called the two groups passive imitators, and instead he chose a third way, which was returning to one's root and homeless intellectual who is neither satisfied with the tradition nor is happy with modernism. But at the same time, he does not discard them. He insisted that the idea would not suggest a return to one's romanticized vision of the ethnic-racial past, but rather it is a renegotiation of modernity on the basis of, I'm quoting him, in a worldview that corresponds to local, social, and cultural realities. Thus, Shariati's return to one's roots should not be taken as a religious or Islamic rejection of modernity, but instead it is a post-colonial reclaiming of modernity. Shariati regarded the return to the self as a cultural diversity and difference. Therefore, it is safe to argue that the return to the self is not a rejection of the other, but rather the recognition of both the self and the other. Well, his return to the self is in fact an emancipatory project, an emancipatory post-colonial project in the context of mid-20th century Iran. It should be noted that Shariati was critical of the misguided and backward discourse of return that produced the hegemony of colonial modernity by dismissing all the other human experiences and achievement. Well, to him, the point of return to the Iranian self is not to perpetuate the colonial myth that only one civilization has access to valuable and dynamic intellectual and cultural resources. Well, it's funny that I should talk about this today. As last week on philosophy and critical thinking, I've talked about multiple locus of epistemic resources. His return to the self is therefore showing that Iranians too have possessed civilization, and they too have contributed a great deal to the emergence and development of collective human culture and civilization. Shariati too argued that by returning to the self and by returning to the cultural and civilizational resources, Iranian would both reclaim their historical contribution to a collective human civilization and would make an indispensable contribution to the negotiation of a civilizational diversity. This is how Shariati developed a way to go beyond the predominant East-West binary. He drew attention to the concurrent symbiosis of science and spirituality in both Eastern and Western civilizational contexts. Shariati pointed to the contribution of ancient Eastern civilization to mathematics, astronomy, naval exploration, algebra, physics, and so on. Well, in fact, Shariati was one of the first few scholars who proposed that the recognition of our de facto civilizational cosmopolitanism would lead to the ideas of human unity and solidarity. His analysis was attentive to the centrality of colonial and imperial domination in shaping Eastern and Western discourse. Shariati's close attention to different aspects of colonialism and imperialism, like the cultural, social, political, and economic aspect, and his works of indigenous modernity with its emphasis on civilizational diversity and the reclaiming of local cultural civilizational resources in the non-West, obviously find common ground with the discourses of many other post-colonial thinkers of the mid-20th century. Well, responding to the post-colonial cause of Shariati and the like-minded intellectuals like Sayed Hussein Alatas for developing an alternative to Europe and the United States in the third world remains a pressing task for intellectuals and activists in non-Western societies. Dr. Murray is on. Dr. Murray, as Dustin Jaybird mentioned earlier, we are waiting to listen to your wisdom. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here, and thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. I personally learned a lot. Well, how to read Shariati? You know, one of my concerns is how to read Shariati and how to try to dislocate the text from the person of Shariati, and then try to relocate and see the text as a body of concepts, instead of being very much concerned about how Shariati said, how Shariati acted, why Shariati did that, or why Shariati didn't do that, or if Shariati was on that position, how he could act it, or why he didn't act like that. Imagine we are not talking about Shariati. We are talking about, say, Fanon, or we are talking about Giddens, or we are talking about Habermas. When we are talking about, for example, Habermas, Durkheim, and these, we don't very much tune into his biographical or into their biographical ways of doing things or ways of not doing things. We try to see the body of the text or the text as a body of concept, then reflect upon that. Having said that, in order to not to be misunderstood, because Mehdi Shariati raised a very good question about post-colonialism and what do we mean by post-colonialism. Let me, at the outset, point out what do I mean by the concept of post-colonialism, or how I understand the concept of post-colonial theory. Here I don't refer to the body of thought primarily concerned with accounting for the political, aesthetic, economic, historical, and social impact of European or Western colonial rule around the globe in the 18th, 19th, 20th, or even 21st century. What I mean by post-colonial theory is post, i.e., an era which occurs after the colonial rule. This is at the political level, and at the metatheoretical or metaphysical level, I mean the moment we start to understand reality out of the box of subject-object relationship, where the subject is the Eurocentric self and the object is the Western world. Shariati is one of the theorists or social critical thinkers who tries to bring into the discussion the idea of multiple modernities, which is based on multiple forms of subjectivities. This is how I understand the concept of post-colonial theory in relation to Shariati. Then take this like as an introduction. I was thinking, is it possible to read Shariati in a MalcolmXian approach? What do I mean by this kind of approach? Malcolm X, he brings up or he coins or constructs two concepts, very, very significant concepts. One is the concept of house Negro, and the other is the concept of field Negro. And by the concept of house Negro, I have explained in my book on Malcolm X. I'm not going to expand it here, but briefly. By the concept of house Negro, he refers to a kind of mentality or a kind of orientation where the relation of the Negro or the person who is subjugated, he doesn't have or she doesn't have his or her own subjectivity. And he understands the reality and life, including his own existence, in relation to the master. But then there is another kind of Negro where this person or this human being, although he is at the disposal of the master, but he works on the field. While he's working on the field, he suffers more, and even his life standards in comparison to the house Negro, where he lives next to the master and actually lives, for example, in the attic, and then tries to be fed with whatever is left over by the master. And most often, the master doesn't beat physically the house Negro, but in comparison, or in the other hand, the field Negro, he's actually beaten. If he doesn't obey physically, the master will beat him, and he doesn't feed the Negro who works on the field with good food. But there is a difference, Malcolm X informs us. The difference between house Negro and field Negro is that the field Negro has his own subjectivity, although he is in chains, although he is beaten, although he is subjugated. But at the end of the day, he knows he is different than the master. There is a distinction between the master and me as a field Negro. So take these two concepts where Malcolm X have coined and try to see if we can read Ali Shariati through these concepts. What do I mean? If we take the concept of house Negro and reconstruct it into house narrative, and then take the concept of field Negro and reconstruct or deconstruct it and turn it into field narrative. And what do I mean by this? Shariati is trying to look at the world and modernity and even the past, present, and his own standing, and tries to say he has a concept called آسمان‌های غیر اروپایی, or non-Western canopies, or non-Western skies, or non-Western point of departure. He's very much concerned to come up with a different kind of narrative, or the concept of modernization, modernity, and the experience of Eurocentric point of departure has expanded itself all over the globe. And when we talk about human being, when we talk about religion, when we talk about, for example, where the position of religion should be, or how should state and religion interact with each other. And most of the concepts we have at our disposal, it is taken from the experience or from the point where the European subject or European subjectivity or Eurocentric vision of reality has built that upon. Now, if we look at Shariati, he's trying to depict another narrative. And that is what I call field narrative, building on what Malcolm X talks about the difference between house Negro and field Negro. In the book, which is called Ensani Bihod or Alienated Human Being, collected work 25, Ali Shariati talks, this is my fuzzy translation. He goes like that: until a person is not devoided from his or her human qualities and personal authenticness, he or she cannot be an instrument or a house Negro, a slave. And if by force he is subjugated, rest assured that he or she would look out for an opportunity to rebel and reclaim his or her autonomy. And even this person is forced to obey, still he or she is not a good obedient slave, or using or employing the concept of Malcolm X, a house Negro. A person who has a character, even if he or she is weak and in need, still he attempts to keep his personality vis-a-vis the other. Such a person cannot be turned into a house Negro. In order to colonize, or new colonial forces, in order to colonize others culturally, economically, politically, in general terms, you need to destroy the shared memory. People who have a shared memory, or a self which is connected to spiritual and historical and existential sense of self, this person, this culture cannot be colonized, cannot be in a servitude of others. So Shariati was trying to depict a narrative which could be called, based on what Malcolm X called, could be called field narrative. And a field narrative is not only the property of Muslim people or Islamic age societies. It is a concept which could be used or employed transculturally for any group or any society which is looking for some kind of emancipation, or any class. Imagine we are in France. Imagine we are in England. Imagine we are in America. The question should be, can Shariati or the Shariatian conceptual framework be used or employed for understanding the for example, working class or marginalized group or women, oppressed women in England, for example, or in America. Or no, Shariati is squarely could be used only for Muslims or people who are sharing, for example, the religion of Islam or belonging to, for example, Shiite tradition. What I see in the text of Shariati, there is this potentiality to be employed in a transcultural fashion. For example, I give you an example. In the book, which is collected work 14, and it is entitled History and Knowledge of Religions, in the page 15, he says something very interesting, that the role of intellectuals who are not actually living in the West should not, he's not talking about intellectuals, for example, in Muslim country, should be concerned only about Muslim societies and Muslim people and try to save or emancipate, for example, Shiites. The language he's using is a universal language. He says, we have to try, we as public intellectuals and thinkers of today, we have to try to find a kind of faith which is not pre-scientific, not scientific, but post-scientific. But it should be logical and sensible or intelligible, and we have to try to soothe the pain of humanity, which after the Second World War has lost his or her ontological security, and we have to try to participate in finding those grand ideals for humanity. ما باید سهیم باشیم در راه یافتن آن ایدئال بزرگ و بشریت را کمک کنیم. When he's addressing the issues of anxiety in the 21st century or at the end of 20th century, he's not talking about anxiety of Muslims or anxiety of Shiites or anxiety of Eastern people. He says humanity today has lost his or her ontological security. And be reminded, he is talking about anxiety and the loss of ontological insecurity in 1971. That means at least 30 years earlier than Anthony Giddens in England, when he was talking about ontological insecurity. But when we, for example, engage with Giddens and Giddensian social theory, we don't say, okay, Giddens talked about this because Labour Party in 2000 did that, and because British society was undergoing some, for example, political upheaval. So we don't narrow down the conceptual framework of Anthony Giddens, but we use it and then apply it to different contexts. I think what we have gone through in terms of engaging with Ali Shariati's conceptual framework is that we don't engage with the concept as concepts. We are not trying to use the concepts in theoretical framework. And in doing so, the body of concepts in Shariati has been at the state of what we may call it under theorization. But the concept by Giddens, by Irving Goffman, by, for example, different social theories, they have been worked through, worked out, and they have become over theorized. So what I suggest when we talk about Shariati, we need first dislocated the text from the person and relocate and seeing it as a body of concepts. And we might be able to use, for example, different critical social theories in a way that they can somehow overlap and contribute and expand the conceptual framework of each other. The way I have, for example, in this session, I try to do it, is trying to use the two concepts of Malcolm X and try to read Shariati through Malcolm Xian concept. Thank you very much. Looking forward for your question and critical remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray, for the wisdom, for the insight, for the beautiful elucidation of Malcolm Xian reading of Shariati. So can we open it to Q question and answer? Yes, yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Michael Norton, please.
Thank you. It was genuinely some fascinating session. Sayed Javad knows that I'm currently writing a book. It's a critical memoir about my experiences of working within the wrongful conviction social movement in the UK, and I'm applying Malcolm X, most of which I've learned from Sayed's previous book on Malcolm X, although I'm looking also at the edited book by Dustin and Sayed as well. And when Sayed talks about reading Shariati, Ali Shariati from Malcolm X, I mean, I think that what you were doing, Sayed, is you were reading Shariati directly quoting Malcolm X. Is that right?
Yes.
So it's not so much that you are saying that. I mean, I know that, I mean, that was fascinating. It was innovative. It was creative. It was wonderful. And, you know, I've been writing a lot of that similar stuff myself about the context I'm writing about. But Shariati himself cited Malcolm X to try to, you know, further explain his ideas and on how his concept can be used. And I agree with you. I agree with you entirely that some of the ideas that have been put forward today very much can be utilised in part of the decolonising the curriculum debate, certainly within teaching, but wider than that within research. I mean, when I'm listening to genuinely wonderful papers today by all the speakers, you know, I mean, my head's popping with references. I'm thinking, well, that's a little bit like Foucault, that's a little bit like Marx, that's a little bit like somebody else. It was good to hear some critique of Shariati's theory or thesis or philosophy. I think that's important because, you know, all the way through, I'm thinking, you know, is it legitimate? And this is what I say to students at all levels. You know, is it legitimate to simply say, I want to take a little bit of Marx, I want to take a little bit of Sartre, I want to take a little bit of Pascal, and then just jiggle it all around and everything's going to be okay? I mean, there are tensions between these different ways of looking at things that need to be dealt with, and maybe Shariati dealt with those, I don't know. But weaker theses that I've seen at all levels of higher education don't do that. They simply just ignore any limitations or tensions between theories, and they just pick and match whatever they think suits them. And I'm not really kind of that strict about theory. I think it's about interpretation and all the rest of it, and it's there to help us to explain. But I think there has to be some acknowledgement that these things don't necessarily just slot together. A big thing that was nearly touched on, I think, by Mehdi Ishmael was power, but I don't think you went into it much, because I was thinking that with regard to that was you know, when we're thinking about all of these things, we can kind of describe how the world is, and we can say, you know, there's this long tradition, isn't there, within, you know, social sciences understood broadly, that, you know, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, describe what is, and try to say what ought to be, you know, and but the thing that always gets in the way is this kind of, it's just kind of sidestepping the kind of issue of power and why things are the way they are. And then that kind of brings me, I suppose, to kind of my last point, which is going back to, say, Javad's paper. And it's like, or thoughts. And it's like, you know, it sounds to me like, you know, and in my own work too, what I'm writing about now, you know, I'm saying that, you know, the lawyers who are working within the criminal justice system, they're basically house mentality. And the victims of wrongful convictions are very much field subjectivity. But how do you actually, once you've described that, and once you've kind of described like colonization in the way that Salad Alatas describes colonization, which is, or colonialism, colonization of the mind, the captive mind, you know, once you've actually observed and described that the populations that we have, because of how the mass media works, because of concepts that have been mentioned, hegemony and stuff like that, we're describing why the populations are the way they are. But how do you unravel that without, you know, Justin's talked a couple of times about, you know, retro utopia. How do you roll back from that? Because if we're living in context in you know, whichever country we're in, we're saying the same things. If we're living in countries where our populations have been detached from their shared memories and rituals, if they have been kind of stupefied, I think it's a wonderful concept that Shariati has about stupefaction. If populations have been stupefied because they're easier to manage, easier to control, right? How do you create a population that doesn't have those characteristics such that they can be emancipated in a kind of collective sense? Or is it simply that this emancipation can only really occur on an individual level? You know, how, because I know, sounds arrogant, but I feel quite, you know, up to speed in terms of understanding some of the kind of limitations and drawbacks of this society in terms of liberation and justice and freedom. But most people I interact with, and I've said this before in other meetings, you know, including colleagues where I work, they do suffer a false consciousness. They are happy with their lives by and large. And if they're not happy with their lives, I can't see how you can mobilize them sufficiently to create the kind of social solidarity that would be needed to kind of change things on a mass level. So it's kind of, I accept all of the kind of descriptions of what the problem is, but my real question is, okay, how do we get from here to where we'd like to be? And then the next bit is, who are we to say where that should be? You know, who are we to say what the world should look like?
Dr. Muri, do you want to respond to the comment?
Oh, it's very difficult question. It's really a difficult question, but I am not going to answer. But what I'm trying to, at least I try to engage with what Michael very beautifully put it and depicted, is that what we can do is raise consciousness and self-consciousness and try to find ways at least to stay away or try to be alert about stupefying moods which are reflecting and disseminating through different ways of mass media, different regimes of knowledge, different regimes of social disciplines, trying to push every one of us into conformity. So I don't think it's I mean, we don't have a very simple answer. Like, I mean, engaging with power structures and try to disseminate critical, emancipative forms of knowledge. But again, this is not something, for example, me sitting in Tehran saying to Mike, who is experiencing a different context and living in a different cultural settings, what I can say, it cannot be used universally. But through engagement and intercivilizational dialogue, at least we can find common grounds and maybe work on these common grounds. This is what I can say to you, Mike.
Yeah, Dr. Shariati.
That's a great question, Michael. Yeah, I think if you were to look at Shariati's prescription, it would say, don't expect anything in the short run, because in the short run, there is nothing you can accomplish because you have to develop. Conscientization requires not only self-conscientization, but social conscientization. And, you know, one thing about the universality of the language, I think I'm glad that Mike Sayed pointed out, is that I've been trying to think about the concepts that Shariati has offered in his theoretical construct outside of religion. In other words, I keep telling myself, okay, so let's take the concept of, let's say, shaheed or martyrdom, right? Shahadat, martyrdom. What does that mean? If I were to take that outside of a context of religion, what can I get from that? Wow. But then when I look at the way Shariati defines shaheed or martyrdom, is not blood and guts and killing and beheading and this and that. Far from that. It means bearing witness to history. Bearing witness to history. That is the universal language, right? In other words, that is an anti-historicist statement. If you believe in martyrdom, then you look at history and all of its ups and downs, all the horrible things and all the good things and everything else. Don't just write it the way the victors write history. Don't look at the history just the way victors look at the history, that everything is great. But there are these horrible episodes that we've had throughout history. That is a defiance of historicism. That shaheed or shahadat is really bearing witness to what has been happening. And as a human being, what is your responsibility to that? Then when it comes to responsibility, then notice that Shariati said, yes, let's say the concept of your responsibility at the moment, particularly in the Shia religion and the concept of waiting, intizar, right? What does he do? He takes intizar and turns it into the religion of protest. Religion of protest. You're waiting. What are you waiting for? What does that mean you're waiting? Well, you're waiting. You're not waiting for Godot. You're waiting actually for for something that may or may not happen, but your responsibility at the moment is to make it happen. In other words, to create a society. I think Dustin alluded to this, that you try to better your society by being engaged in your society, by all your beings, by all your abilities, through all your, facing all the challenges. Then as a responsible human being, you have to move forward. One thing I'd like to point out is that, when we say, well, Shariati was influenced by existentialism or by Marxism, or I think Sayyid Akhlaq pointed out that Shariati looked at the division of society into oppressed and oppressor. I would like to say to you that, if you look at it from the point of view of a Eurocentric point of view, you'll say, yeah, hey, he just took Marx and, wholeheartedly and incorporated it into his discussion. But the reality is, if you look at Shariati, he starts his philosophy of history by the story of the two brothers, right? Cain and Abel. Not really the two brothers, the prototypes. The first murder in history occurs based on private property, a negation of public ownership. Everything belongs to everybody. So it is way before Marx that, that whole idea was developed, was introduced and developed. And Shariati builds his philosophy of history on that. And so to me, it's like you have to look at Shariati in its totality. If you were to pluck and take one thing and place it in another school of thought, obviously it's going to look weird. And that's exactly what, unfortunately, some of our intellectuals do. That's why they end up with, accusations that Ishmael Mehdi pointed out, all of these things. Well, he didn't know anything about anything. Okay. All right. So what does that mean then? All these people were reading this, they're just stupid. God's greatest gift to humanity. Why don't you tell us then, what is right and what's wrong? So my point is, there is that notion that really defies Shariati and what Shariati was trying to say, that educate yourself. Before you open your mouth, try to understand what you're trying to say. And so it's very interesting that in Iran, although let me just point out that I didn't mean to say that Akhlaq was doing that. Well, I'm just saying that I built upon what he said. I think that is true, though. He's mentioned repeatedly, that Shariati is borrowed from Marx and existentialism and etc. He was a materialist. He was a Sunni. Why was he Sunni? Because when, contrary to some of the dogmatic, Shia believe that somehow if you mention the name Omar, that you have to just use profanity, he said no. He was one of the greatest statements in Islamic history. And so on that basis, then they said, well, he was a Sunni. Or because he did not really resort to that kind of language describing certain things outside of Shia theology. And as for the historicism, post-colonialism, you're right. I've been struggling with this. To me, Shariati is looking at not a beginning of colonialism, but does not see an end yet. So it is a ongoing process. It's a lingering process. And so the theory for me is missing those fundamental concepts of post-colonial theory. I do believe in post-colonial studies, certainly. It has produced different results in different parts of the world, yet with one universal totality, that is those colonized and the colonizers, but different results. But the question is to Shariati is, well, how do you deal with this? Well, you have to educate, you have to get involved in the process. And then as an intellectual, again, Roshan Fiqh, it's your goddamn responsibility to go and teach people. Excuse my French. Anyway, yeah.
Well, here's the thing, right? I mean, is a post-colonial subjectivity, even possible? Because if the way we think and the way we feel and the way we act is a product of discourses, okay, that Shariati himself, for instance, is also a product of certain discourses. I think it was, sorry, I think you're Sayad, Akhlaq. You were saying that, when you were young and you were in Iraq and your father was more a traditional type of Islamic follower, and younger people had a slightly different interpretation of Islam, and they were more inclined, and you were more inclined to follow maybe Shariati's interpretation of Islam. I mean, right there, you've got these two different ways of thinking about, for instance, Islam, and you've got a divide potentially between more traditional older people and less traditional younger people. So the younger people's minds are a product of those discourses that shape how they think and feel and act, vis-a-vis a kind of power relation between them and the older, more traditional, inverted commas, Islamic believers and followers who think a slightly different way. And they, you know, so is it possible? Is it not asociological to suggest that there's something outside of all of that, which is the correct way to think and be? That's what I'm asking. Because we kind of, you know, Sayyid Javad said, you know, he also had a problem with the idea of post-colonialism or post-colonial, but all of our minds are colonized. Every thought that we have is, you know, we're all quite, as far as I know, we're quite odd bunch of people here, right? But we still have a worldview. And that worldview is a product of the discourses that we have chosen to adopt. You know, as somebody said, a few of you said, that Shariati himself, he believed that we could select certain elements and we can construct our own worldview or whatever. And we seem to have done that. But our counterparts, the people who we believe are not enlightened, the people we think need to be emancipated, they've also, unless we see them as entirely passive, there's also some agency at play where they have chosen purposefully to select these elements to their discursive makeup. These things that we say that their minds are colonized by, they have selected them, they've chosen not to resist them. We want to, I love this idea of social conscientization. I love that concept, that we want to kind of help them to think differently, but we're also trying to, in some sense, colonize their thought. Because we think that the way we think is superior to how they think. And they might say, sod off. I don't want to listen to your pseudo-superior discourses. This suits me fine. Are we not being arrogant sometimes in how we depict these people in need of emancipation? These are questions.
Yeah.
A lot of it devil's advocate. But I want to just say for the record, I personally have learned so much in the 5 or 6 of these that have been done. And these are some of the questions that are coming out of me because of what you people are doing to me. So it's your fault.
Can I add something? Okay, so can I add something?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, just wanted to make a clarification about what I said, that the Shariati sees all Marx, Sartre, Pascal, and Ali. So I think it doesn't mean that Shariati is a just reading Western civilization and Western thinking and see something good here, something good here, and something good here, and collect all of them and make a new product. No, but what I wanted to say, just to understand it, when I'm talking about, for example, American pragmatism, William James, he says he reads the history of the empiricist philosopher and rationalist philosopher and find out something's good in this branch of philosophy. He called them tough philosopher or tender philosopher, and combine them. So that shows a kind of the talent, a kind of the even more than that. So Shariati for sure had something. He just not collect elements of this thinker to bring together and can compare them to Ali. He read Marx different than Marxists. That's why when he talking about Dr. Shariati just talk about the history of the sons of the Adam when he reads the history, of course, but it's he reads Marx differently. He reads Sartre differently. He reads Pascal differently, and then find something in them. Then they are compatible and they are consistent with each other, and then make a new new mosaic or new shape that it's look like Ali. And then particularly in his indigenous or domestic culture. That's what I wanted to say, not to reduce the impact of Shariati, but it's a very, but another things that I wanted to say, Shariati, still I believe Shariati actually was more passionate thinker than a analytical thinker. So there are a lot of contradictions we can find in Shariati, but he didn't care because he had a good idea. He wanted to change society. He maybe this is a little exaggeration, but just to get an idea. He knew what he doesn't want, but he was not very clear what he wants. So he knew the crisis. Because of that, I just told you, he is a deep thinker of the crisis. He knows all problems, and he knows that what to do. He knows that we cannot just look at history of Islam. We have to learn from Marx, from Sartre, from Pascal, but still they are not enough for us. What I mean by us, the first audience of the Shariati that are Muslim. So he thinks we need more than that, and he looks at the history of Islam. That's and the last point that I wanted to say about the concept of post-colonialism with regard to Shariati. So I strongly believe that Shariati was influenced by colonialism. So not just his understanding of the Marx and Sartre and all Western philosopher. Even we know a lot of times, even in his prayer, Niayesh, when he talks about Quran, it's talk about the Aish, about the Zainab, about Hussein, about Ali. He refers to a lot of Orientalists. When he talks about Salman, he refers to Orientalists and highlight that and say, okay, we have to learn from them. That means that he is really affected by Orientalist thinking, and he's not out of that context. So his post-colonial thinking has its own limits, and so of course we need to discuss more about the feature of that. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
If I could, I'd like to address something from my dear brother Sayed Javad. You know, Malcolm's rhetorical use of the house Negro and the field Negro. I mean, we know precisely what he was trying to say in the 1960s Americas, looking at what he thought was Dr. King, you know, in the civil rights movement, opposed to what would eventually become the Black Power movement. But I think, you know, we have another category that we have to include into this, which comes directly from the history of slavery in the United States. And that is the house Negro that still maintained subjectivity. Because what we knew about house Negroes, there were, of course, the head house Negro. That's precisely the one Malcolm was talking about, right? That's the one with no subjectivity. They were basically the right hand of the master, right? The master always reserved the right to punish and or beat the house Negroes themselves. The overseers could always beat the field Negroes, right? But the master had control over the house Negroes. But what we do know from history is that oftentimes the most dangerous enslaved individual to a master was the house Negro himself, because he knew, or she knew, how they operated. They knew where they were in the house. They knew what they did in the house. They knew what kind of things they had in the house. They were the closest ones to him. The master trusted oftentimes those house Negroes. So it seems like we have to have some kind of category wherein you have, if we apply it to Shariati, someone who's living in the house with the master, but maintaining their own subjectivity. Right? That would be interesting, as to figure out who, if we could theorize Shariati in that line of thinking, I think that would be very productive. The other thing I wanted to say was, we talked about shared memories, and those who had shared memories, or those nations, those peoples who have shared memories, aren't really colonizable. And I think we have to remember that, especially in the West, that we are a highly class stratified society. I mean, in America right now, our super rich are the richest in the world, and our poor live in abject poverty. And so what we have is in the West, we have the Willensgemeinschaft societies, the willed community societies, like America, like Canada, like increasingly the UK, and increasingly continental Europe, societies that are rooted on a variety of people coming together as citizens, that we too have shared memories that have either been erased or taught highly selectively, right? And I would go as far as to say that in the US, we have shared ideologies, not even shared memories, right? We have a shared ideology that we get in schools. It starts to be challenged in colleges. And you start to see now with critical race theory, the reason why they're challenging that is because it is saying, hey, we have a shared history. We have shared memories here that we've been suppressing, right? And as long as, in a Freudian sense, as long as we're suppressing it, it's coming out ass backwards, right? In these different ways. And we need to address the shared memories as opposed to the shared ideologies. And it's interesting that in the West right now, the dialogue is, or the narrative is that the far right is the one that's trying to bring back a shared memory, right? It's to say, hang on a sec, these newcomers to the West are not part of our shared history, not part of our pre-political foundations, if you will. They're somehow a challenge to it. Because we are accommodating their needs, we are losing our own memory, our own identity. But the problem with them is that they weaponize an idealized past, an idealized memory. Again, it's very selective memory. You know, Britons that think Britain was homogenous before the modern period forget all the invasions that happened, you know. And they can say, well, okay, they were all white. Well, now we're back into American context with this idea of what white people are, right? As opposed to European identities. So, you know, even here, for Americans, for Canadians, for Westerners to be colonized, especially by the desires and needs of neoliberal capitalism, we too, our memories have to be wiped clean and just basically replaced with this ideology that somehow supports the modern consumerism to keep us fat, happy, and stupid.
Can I say something? Well, thank you, Dr. Akhlaq, for clarifying that. I've heard, you know, oftentimes that Shariati was eclectic. I mean, there's one of the really, you know, madly in love with Shariati individual constantly says Shariati was eclectic. And then so one day I asked him, what do you mean by eclectic? Well, you know, he didn't mean, you know, this and that. But I said, you know, so if Shariati takes concepts from Quran and somehow you find something similar in, let's say, Western philosophy, how is that being eclectic? Because ultimate Shariati's purpose was to fight this deculturalization that was occurring, returning to self, authentic self. In fact, he's big on returning to self. And then on that basis, also some people criticizing him, saying, oh, he wants to go back to the old days. No, that's not what he means. He means returning to self. Let's look at the culture to see what's in there, to see, examine it, to see if it's worth using it today for emancipation towards, you know, a greater society, building a greater society, towards humanity. So in that sense, I think the Shariati is very much universal. And I think that once again, to me, it's really important that we look at the totality of the meta-theoretical of Shariati, and that is all concepts which he defines in that context should be, of course, left in that context. Yes, we can find, you know, similar statements, concepts elsewhere, but that's what really he was opposing, that somehow, you know, this Eurocentrism of the non-Europeans is getting really sickening, that it seems everything has to be somehow traced to Europe. And unfortunately today, we're still doing the same thing. Right now in Iran, I see people talking, you know, one sentence has 5 words, you know, 4 of them are English. I don't know who they, you know, who they're communicating with. What if they don't understand this stuff? Who are there specific statements you're making about yourself, who you are? Is this a rejection of what you have, your own culture? So there are so many different issues. I think, you know, Sayyid was right. Back in late 60s, 60s and the early 70s, the Shariati introduced all of these things that then later on we see into the sociology of Giddens, people like Giddens, and the, you know, post-colonial theory in many ways, you know, borrowed heavily. But again, to post-colonial studies, I should say, I don't believe there's such thing as post-colonial theory, really, because to me, theory, it has a conceptual structure that really can, anyway, shed light on the present beside and on a universal fashion, but also show you ways of looking at the reaching perhaps or guiding society towards a better future. But at any rate, when I look at the conversation today, I think that, you know, Shariati was also a victim of that Eurocentricity that dominates, I think, the discourse in the non-European world. And again, if you look at some of these, you know, wonderful people like Dalsel and Shariati and Magnolo and, you know, and Quijano and others in Latin America, they look at, you know, Eurocentrism as it's an illness that is really, and that's for a purpose. The purpose is, again, deculturalization. And so as long as we don't understand the culture that we have ourselves, we are a victim of that Eurocentrism. But then what is in Latin America? What's in Africa? What's in the Middle East? Those are still very much unknown. Thank you.
You know, in Ismail's amazing book there, the right writes back, I start off with a short discussion that I had when I was in Germany some years back about philosophy and the nature of philosophy. And my German friend who went through World War II as a youngster, he said about philosophy, he said, philosophy, real philosophy, is created in Germany, corrected in Britain, and corrupted in the US. Right. And I'm thinking about, I'm like, there's maybe some truth to that.
Yeah.
But what I didn't think about until, you know, later reflection was that what it's presupposing is that it is purely a European, North American affair, philosophy.
Right.
That philosophy is created in the West and somehow disseminates outwards. Right. And so, you know, I'm working with an author right now for Iqbarosis Press who's writing on Iqbal. And he's, you know, in conversation between Western philosophers and Iqbal. And he gets so much flack from his Pakistani colleagues for doing that, you know, that the West is hegemonic, you know, they think they only do philosophy. So our strategy is to not talk about Foucault, not talk about Adorno, don't talk about Marx. And they're really hard on him for doing that. And the other way around is the European side that says, look, we create it. What they do with it later, that's their affair. Let them play around with our ideas. You know what I mean? That's not our business. And so you have this dichotomy that basically looks at each other and says, I'm not talking to you.
Yeah.
Right. And that's in so many ways, that's what we're dealing with. And I think Shariati is one of those that's a bridge that says, no, we have no choice. We have to talk to each other. We have to learn each other's vocabularies, right? Because we will, in many ways, find the overlapping consensus. There's going to be a lot of things that, of course, they're just going to disagree on put two philosophers in the same room, they're going to disagree on so many things, right? But we still have to find that overlapping consensus. In order to do that, we have to talk to each other. We have to learn each other's language. We have to learn each other's philosophies and our social sciences. We have to go to school with each other.
Yeah, and admit our own faults. You know, I was reading something about Hegel and his phenomenology of the spirit, and that how Haitian Revolution really influenced that Hegel didn't really believe these people have the right to have a revolution. Isn't that interesting that Napoleon somehow imposed this fine on them that they just finished about 60, 70 years ago. They paid it off, 150 million francs that they had to pay to France for removing the colonial yoke from their shoulders, the neck. And they paid it off in 1947. This is the contradiction that the French have to deal with, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Okay, then what does that mean in terms of what the empire does outside? And so, are they not human beings? See, there is that dehumanization. I guess part of philosophy, Western philosophy, that Western philosophers must admit. Maybe Foucault and Sartre and others, perhaps, like Sartre in the introduction to The Wretched of the Earth, mentions that, we train these individual agents in Europe and then send them to Africa to do our dirty work, something along that line. And so where does that come from? Where does the responsibility today? We're not talking about 19th century. We're talking about today. Where does the responsibility of Western intellectuals begin and end when it comes to actually look at what the consumption of what they created, the intellectual product that they created, is doing to the rest of the world, right? And the agents in the rest of the world that are actually consuming all of that. By the way, that consumerism that Dr. Akhlosha pointed out about Shariati, it wasn't just consumerism of product. Shariati was also concerned with consumerism in thoughts, how we just take these packaged, bits and pieces, and it's just like, we have no clue as to what they mean in our context, and we continue to repeat.
If there's no more comment or question, can we call it a day, Dustin? Or does anyone have any more comment, question, points?
One comment. Excellent work. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Then thank you very much, everyone, for your beautiful presentation, beautiful discussion on Shariati. And then I'm gonna hand it over to our dear brother Dustin Bird to call it a day.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's wonderful. And like many of you said, these are so amazing just for learning. I have the whole notebook. I'm just taking notes because as you talk, I'm conjuring up ideas for future work. And so with the videos, I've got some time coming up since we're finishing our semester. So I'll be able to edit the videos and get them up online. And I'll send the link to Syed Javad, and then he can disseminate it out to everybody so you can watch yourself become famous on YouTube.